So our speakers today, of course, are Nate Hughes and Peter Marks. This bio was provided on your invitation, so I won't go into detail, but we have Nate, who's an alum of the Bloomberg School, and Peter, who works for the FDA. So I will turn it over to them now.
Great. Thanks, Elizabeth. I hope everyone can hear me. This is Nate Hughes, and just so delighted to be back and lecture for Johns Hopkins and for the Bloomberg School of Public Health, and very excited to have Dr. Peter Marks with us as well. And what I'll do is go over the outline and really talk about the points of what we'll be discussing, which are twofold. And I just wanted to give you a snapshot of COVID right now. More than 2.4 million people have died so far from COVID-19. Millions more have suffered from severe morbidities. In the United States alone, life expectancy fell by a full year in the first 6 months of 2020. And for African Americans, the drop was about 2.7 years. So if you go to the next slide, Elizabeth, I'll just capture the lecture and the outline. So from my perspective, I'll be talking about the strategic decision-making under unprecedented public health crisis for the clinical research organizations. I work for one now called Cato SMS, and also for what we call our sponsors, which are the pharma and biotech companies. And I'm actually going to highlight two that I'm quite familiar with and was very fortunate to, one of which to work with closely, which is Humanigen, and then another company called DURECT, both in the San Francisco Bay Area where I'm located. And Peter will be talking about accelerated vaccine development, whereas I will discuss the accelerated clinical therapeutics, some of the bottlenecks, and how we dealt with those, and lessons learned in preparing for the future. So what I'll do is I'll hand it off to Peter so we have ample time for Q&A, which we're both excited about.
Great, thanks very much. So, you know, people have asked about how this whole process of Operation Warp Speed sped up vaccine development. And the way to describe this, I think, is the easiest way to understand it is that normally vaccine development is a highly risk-averse process. Vaccines are not high-margin products, and because of that, when one does development, one makes sure that every step checks out before one gets to the next one normally. So you have phase 1 development, some dead space, phase 2 development, some dead space where people are looking at the results, phase 3, et cetera. Also, manufacturing does not start until very late in the game because nobody wants to waste a lot of money setting up manufacturing facilities until you know you've got a vaccine that's useful. Now, in a pandemic, the situation is very different. Here we have a pandemic which has cost the economy literally trillions of dollars. And so a few $100 million or a few $1 billion even of manufacturing at risk becomes a very attractive proposition. So if we go to the next slide, here one can just say, okay, let's take out all of the white space. And when one does that, one starts to do phase 1, 2, 3 trials. One starts to scale up manufacturing very early on in the process. One does as much clinical work at the same time as some of the little preclinical things one needs to do to get towards the ultimate authorization. And one uses our regulatory tools of emergency use authorization to avoid needing to go through a somewhat more protracted regulatory process of submitting a biologics license application. Ultimately, taking what could have normally been a 3 or 4 year process and making it into a process that took under a year in the case of these COVID-19 vaccines till we have something that's been deployed. If I have the next slide. And really, what's happened here is we've accelerated the process by giving clear guidance on what we expected from these products. We've had early conversations between regulators and manufacturers, which has helped eliminate false steps. We've integrated different phases into one clinical trial. In fact, the Pfizer trial was a phase 1, 2, 3 trial. We've been used to now manufacturing large quantities of product and risk. And this morning I was speaking to someone, we only wish that we'd even had manufactured more at risk at this point. Mm-hmm. And we're using the optimal pathway, in this case, emergency use authorization to facilitate product availability. Next slide, please. the way we issued guidance, we realized that we'd have to make sure people were clear about what we were doing, so that because we were accelerating things, it was important to have people know upfront that we had boxes we were going to check. And so our guidance documents put forth the criteria that we were going to use to say that the vaccines that came through this process met our standards. And that's why in June of this past year, we issued some guidance. And then in October, we issued more guidance so that people knew that when these vaccines came through the process, they were going to actually meet some standards for safety and efficacy, and not just be rush jobs that people would be concerned about. So the next slide. Ultimately, we also described the fact that for emergency use authorization, these vaccines would meet our standards. And although they would not necessarily meet the BLA, the Biologics License Application standard of the that we have, because of the time it would take to get all of the manufacturing data and everything else, we wanted to see clear and compelling efficacy from a well-designed phase 3 clinical trial. Those are the kinds of trials that are used to provide the compelling efficacy that we need when we normally approve a product. Granted, we wouldn't have the same amount of safety follow-up data that we would, but this gives us the kind of compelling efficacy data that we would need. And then we made sure that we had good evaluation of these quality, safety, and efficacy. We took things to public advisory committee meetings so that people could see an external group of experts confirm out that FDA's evaluation of quality, safety, and efficacy made sense. And we told everyone, and we continue to use enhanced post-deployment surveillance. So the next slide. So what did we end up with? After this, we've ended up with several vaccines now. There were half a dozen vaccines in the what was Operation Warp Speed, what is now the COVID response team's portfolio. 3 of them now have emergency use authorization as of this past Saturday. The 2 mRNA vaccines and the non-replicating viral vector vaccine from Janssen, if I have the next slide. And these are pretty effective vaccines. I mean, the 2 mRNA vaccines out of the gate had 94, 95% effectiveness against moderate and severe COVID-19. They were all studied in large groups of patients. You can see trial sizes from 30,000 on up to 43,000 plus. And I put the slide up here to just show you that these vaccines were studied in a cross section of the population. So we know that we're not missing the Black African-American population, the Latinx population, or the elderly population in their ability to prevent COVID-19. If I have the next slide, there is good efficacy of these vaccines. They're all very good at keeping people out of the hospital with severe COVID-19. If you look at all 3 of them, there were few hospitalizations or no hospitalizations after day 28 for Janssen. It is true there's a little bit of difference in the efficacy against moderate to severe COVID-19 between the 3 of these vaccines. But by and large, these are 3 very effective, safe vaccines for COVID-19. And that's what led to the authorizations. Maybe the next slide. They also, of course, have potential side effects. And if you look here, injection site pain, not uncommon with these vaccines. Probably the most important thing that people who have had this vaccine should be aware of is that particularly after the second dose, younger people, a little bit more so than older people, tend to have this sensation of fatigue. That's just the body's immune system doing its thing. So in general, we've been telling people after that second dose in particular for the 2-dose vaccines, don't plan on a strenuous day. The next slide. So just to kind of conclude here, this has been something where we continue to do safety monitoring. with both passive monitoring through our vaccine adverse event reporting system and active monitoring through a variety of systems. But we're feeling very comfortable that if there were some major safety signal or even some minor safety signal, we would be able to detect it. And so the final slide, I think, that I'll show is one that just basically summarizes by saying we've managed to, if you show the last slide, yep, yeah, that we've managed to speed up vaccine development here without compromising our safety and efficacy standards. We've done it through a transparent process, and hopefully that will help reduce anti-vaccination sentiment because there has been enough of that recently. And in the middle of a pandemic, there really is no place for that if we've done a good job at FDA making sure the vaccines are properly safe and effective. And I'll stop there. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Peter. Thanks so much. So now that we heard from Dr. Peter Marks about the vaccine development, I want to really talk about some of the patients that we don't want to slip through the cracks, so to speak, or might have missed the window of the vaccine. So focus on clinical therapeutics. And one of the ideas and one of the theories I've always been interested in, I want to apply to these two case studies, is blue ocean strategies from the mid-90s from Inside Business School. And I want to talk about that and where I think clinical trials could shift and we could see somewhat of a change to an extent while not sacrificing safety, of course. So next slide is fine. So let's talk about those two. And one of the first scenario I'm going to talk about and lead you through a narrative here, and that's a phase 3 study to evaluate the efficacy and safety of a monoclonal antibody called linzilimab. This is with patients with COVID-19. Now, I want to talk about this story because I think it's quite interesting. This was March of 2020. And I had reached out to the CEO of this company working for a clinical research organization. And the trial that I initially contacted him about was quite different from COVID. It was an acute versus graft host disease. And he wanted to talk about COVID because he was with his ClinOps director had access to data from Wuhan, China, that about 40% or so of patients were dying of acute respiratory distress syndrome. And he had a trial ongoing, a 5 ongoing multi-center trial in cytokine release syndrome. And just to talk about cytokine release, it's this inflammation of the body, which could potentially lead to ARDS. And so he had this trial in investigational new drug status with the oncology division and was interested in transitioning it potentially to the infectious disease division of the FDA. And so he was interested in us potentially rewriting this IND. And this is what I would call a strategic pivot. And what was interesting about that is we were able to, with the FDA, get expanded access of this drug. And this led to, in the public domain, a press release here in the San Francisco area. And another company in IPF, which is idiopathic pulmonary fibrosis, also was interested in potentially pivoting or looking at the IND for COVID-19, and which they did. And I thought that was not just interesting, but really led me to the next case study. So if you go to, and I'll talk about that in a second, but if you go to the next slide, this is the highlights of the Humanigen trial, which is focusing on this strategic pivot. And some of the key concerns were trying to find the physician investigator, trying to find the right patients. And one of the issues that came up with my conversation with Humanigen was that no one could have predicted for a couple of months around Thanksgiving that Wisconsin had higher rates than Florida. So the idea was don't chase the disease, trace the course, the trajectory of the disease. And I think that was really important. And if you look at the key findings, currently the trial is about 500 patients, about 514 patients. So it's currently full enrollment. And as opposed to 10 sites that we started with, now Humanigen's at about 28 sites. So really just a fantastic and interesting trial that's ongoing now. Next slide. So the next company is called DURECT. DURECT is their focus is in alcohol hepatitis, and they were interested in looking at the liver as a secondary target. There was liver damage for inflammation that looked like SARS, and they were interested in pursuing this trial for patients. And so one of the bottlenecks was finding the right patients, and also again changing nature of the disease. They were interested in trying to understand the nature of the disease. And this looked like a compressed version of ARDS. And so, this trial is ongoing, and there's currently enrollment that they're continuing. Next slide. So this is the blue ocean strategy, and I think that what's interesting here is looking at creating an uncontested market space. If you look at the red ocean strategy, this is kind of traditional. You're looking at almost think of a Shark Tank, competing in an existing marketplace, being the competition. What I think we're seeing with the advent of so many changes in clinical trials, such as remote monitoring, some of the changes of technology, is creating uncontested market spaces and making the competition somewhat irrelevant. And I think that with this strategic pivot, one of the questions is, are we going to go back to the way clinical trials has always been done, or will there be some interesting changes and structural changes that are ongoing? And so again, this is the issue, and this is the graphic that I wanted to show. Next slide. So some of the key challenges are the learning curve of CROs, the competitive nature of the CROs, the competition for patients, because you have to understand a lot of the CROs are competing for patients. Trying to gain informed consent of patients in the ICUs was a bottleneck. The remote monitoring of ICUs, time-sensitive morbidity, mortality data. These are all some of the key issues. And I wanted to also make sure that I showed the hospital admissions. And this is a nice slide, because although hospital admissions, of course, has decreased dramatically, and if you look at that decrease, it's about a 62% decrease from January to now, that these patients still exist and still need therapeutics. And next slide. This is the CDC website, and this is a negative 11.3% change in the 7-day average. So just to make sure, again, reiterating the point of the CEO of Humanigen, so not to miss this, the patients that have missed the window, to make sure they don't slip through the cracks, that therapeutics is somewhat of a safety net. Next slide. So some of the key learnings and lessons is agility, the ability to pivot when needed under a public health crisis, this collective approach of public-private partnerships. And I just want to highlight too, just lecturing with Dr. Peter Marks, if there wasn't COVID, we might be at a lecture perhaps on CAR T therapy or cell gene therapy, but we're now speaking about COVID-19. So this collective public-private approach, partnering with regulatory authorities, partnering with clinical care team, this need for inpatient coordinators. One really interesting point that DURECT brought up is the regular kind of usual typical barriers in clinical trials wasn't necessarily there during their trial in COVID-19. That is that the expedited timelines and working with the FDA was relatively much easier at this point, but the need for the PI, their need for training in the ICU, those were the issues. So the preparing for the future is building capacity of our medical workforce. Scenario planning has to do with preparing for the next epidemic or pandemic rather. So a simulation, for example, pandemic preparedness of hospitals, the need for a national emergency plan, and this advanced mechanism for real-time transparent data collection. Next. Oh, I put this slide in as terms of game changing and blue oceans. This is an interesting analogy and metaphor. This player for the Golden State Warriors, Steph Curry, and the team sat down. And one of the ways they won a championship was perfecting through the three-shot, so the three-pointer rather, as opposed to just layups and fast breaks. They won championships by perfecting during practice, the three-pointer. And so this was changing the game and winning championships. And that is it. Now, perfect. We have 10 minutes for Q&A. I know there's a lot of information, but.
Thank you so much, Nate and Peter. So we will open it up for questions. Feel free to either submit something in the chat or just unmute and ask directly.
Yeah, hi, this is Dr. Ira Lawrence, a senior level executive in the industry. And more importantly, I have now gotten my 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine, which is awesome. And by the way, Peter, minimal side effects. My question is, my wife and I are both participating in the Be Safe app on our phones, which I think is brilliant. Is that something you think, Peter, we could think about using not just for this, but in the future for large scale post-marketing surveillance of new products? It was easy amazingly simple, and I thought it was getting a great deal of great information. Love your thoughts.
Thanks for that question. You know, some people ask us what is going to stay the same and what is going to change post COVID. We're not going to be able to sustain the in by 9, out by 5 IND review that we've been doing sometimes for vaccines. That's not sustainable. On the other hand, this vSafe text-based monitoring system, it's amazing because already we've been able to use it to confirm out that what was seen in the clinical trials in terms of, for instance, the incidence of fatigue seems very similar in the real world. And a variety of the other, I mean, what's amazing is you can now in real time with millions of people now actually confirm out what was seen in the clinical trial. So I do think, and having participated in myself now, it's a pretty easy thing to do. It does mean that you might miss some people who don't have access to smartphones, but given the increasing smartphone use by even older individuals, even the old individuals, I think it's a really great solution to this, and I think we'll be seeing use of this in the future. Agreed.
Can you speak a little bit to how the potential booster shots might work? What does that approval process look like?
Yeah, great question. I would have had slides on those, but for the time. So very quickly, we are trying to make sure that we have a process in place to make sure that if we have a change in the composition of the vaccine, because we have enough of a change in the virus that's circulating, that we don't have to go through another huge clinical trial. So we will use immunologic endpoints in a group of a few hundred people to make sure that the immune response is robust against the new strain that we're dealing with. Also understanding whether that vaccine against the new strain also covers the old strain, because that's probably going to be an issue of understanding whether you need one component or two components in the vaccine. And then finally, we also need to make sure that the vaccine is safe in people who have already received 2 doses of the vaccine as a third boost. So those are what we'll do, but it's not going to require big clinical efficacy studies. It will probably require studies that should only take 2 to 3 months to go from start to finish in this case, because especially for these studies of just a couple hundred people, we've enrolled them in the past in other situations of pandemics in just a week or two's time. So you can get a whole cohort that go through together and get the results pretty quickly.
Thank you.
I have a question. My name is Duncan Brown. I'm a bioinformatics consultant in biotech. So Nate had mentioned that there was some potential that the approach of the FDA to clinical trials might actually change as a result of COVID. And I'd like to get maybe a little bit expansion on that thought and some reaction from Peter regarding the likelihood of that over time.
Yeah, I think what you might see is you might see us looking at ways of simplifying participation in clinical trials. One of the things that's come out of COVID-19 is we realize that sometimes you make clinical trials simpler and you actually can get more people into participation, and you actually get a more robust data set. So I think there may be a push in the future towards more pragmatic clinical trials. There certainly is going to be a push in the future for more remote monitoring. Any number of things that can cut down on the number of visits, plus the ability to conduct these trials further away to have a greater reach into the real world of how how drugs are applied. I mean, I think all too often we've seen results in clinical trials that are the results in the real world tend to be a decrement of some multiple, sometimes even from what one sees in the original clinical trials. Here, if you start by having a more inclusive clinical trial, hopefully the results that come out at the other end are more robust.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Norman Sussman, and Nate, thanks for inviting me. That was this is really time well spent. So I think there is a bit of anxiety on both ends, but I'm curious, Peter, when FDA must have had a little bit of anxiety about a new type of vaccine, just pushing it out and saying, on balance, the pandemic is so lethal that what's our downside? But I wonder if in other circumstances that would have required more time.
Yeah, so great question. I mean, we had experience with mRNA-based vaccines for several years because they've been under investigation for other infectious diseases. They had been in development potentially for influenza, for Zika, and so these were not, at least this wasn't the very first time that mRNA vaccines were going into clinical trials in humans. So that helped because at least we had some longer term data to understand these vaccines. I do take your point, which is that, if this wasn't a pandemic, we probably would have wanted to see at least 6 months of safety data before giving a normal biologics license application, or maybe even a year. But in this case, what we did was we put in place very good post-market surveillance systems, which are, I think we are already starting to see them bear fruit in terms of making sure that there are not signals, or there are signals that we have to be careful about. And I think the fact that we're able to pick up rare allergic reactions with these good thing as a positive control, and the fact that we're already able to look at certain things and see that there are not signals for certain things is helpful. The real proof will come about a month or two from now, when we start to have a large enough database of events that we can really query for some of the rare adverse events like Guillain-Barré syndrome, which are typically 1 in a million anyway. And if you wanted to pick up a rate of 2 in a million, you really need to have millions in the database.
Thanks.
So we'll take our final question today from the chat. Martha says, do you have any insights about the study that's not yet peer reviewed, published in the Lancet, to the effect that 14 to 28 days post Pfizer vaccine is 85% immunity?
Yeah, I'll look forward to seeing those data, because what we have seen is that after 2 doses, and the problem is that right now we have an estimate that Pfizer has that after 1 dose there was about 52% effectiveness, and the reason why is because almost everyone in the study got 2 doses. But I just want everyone to take a step back. The reason why we think these vaccines are going to be very good at preventing against some of the circulating variants is because they get to very high antibody titers. If you give 1 dose of the Pfizer vaccine, you may have protection against the currently circulating strain of COVID-19 in the United States, but whether it will protect against the South African variant is in question, because one needs higher antibody titers with that particular vaccine, at least in the lab. So I am not one that is really big, as everyone seems to be like this big bandwagon, particularly in the past few days, of, well, let's just give everyone 1 dose of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine and call it a day. I think better do it right the first time. Let's get people vaccinated, especially because within a month or 2, we will have a sufficient amount of these vaccines. So it's probably better to know that people who are going out into the environment now are fully vaccinated. But once you've had that second Pfizer or Moderna vaccine, you can be pretty confident. I mean, I would not change wearing a mask or keeping socially distant, but there's a certain amount of confidence that gives people. And I don't think we're going to have that same confidence that people will have after 1 dose, especially because I suspect that 85% number is going to be based on, end quote, evidence and interpolation, as opposed to what we have from clinical trials.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I'll say one final thank you to our speakers today, Mr. Hughes and Dr. Marks, for a wonderful presentation. And of course, thank you to all of you for attending today. And I would like to extend a very quick apology to those people who were hanging out in the waiting room for a couple of minutes. That I'm sorry about that, but we will send out the recording to this event so you can see the first part of Dr. Marks's presentation. So again, thank you all so much. We have these sessions every week. So if you are looking to see what else we are hosting, please come back to our website that I will also link in the recording when I send it out later this week. And with that, I will go ahead and stop the recording and see you all next time.